Okay, so hello and welcome back to the next installment of Train Hopper channel, and well, we're just going to jump right into it. This is going to be a little bit less route specific and or political as the last one was. Well, it's still going to be a little bit political because, I mean, it's history. History and politics and labor struggles always tend to have politics mixed into them just as a habit of their existence. Occupational hazard, that's the word I'm thinking of. And if anyone's gonna ever see this and bother, like, why don't you release this on like some African American historical day? This channel on me is just never gonna have enough for planning to be that pandery, nor do I care to be that pandery. So these get released whenever I do them, and in the immortal words of someone, I do what the hell I want. So we're just gonna get into it. So the Pullman Porters were a main fixture of first-class travel and overnight trains in the United States for over a century. The Pullman Porters are often an overlooked part of the socioeconomic development of the United States and was one of the biggest vehicles for social change that led to the modern civil rights movement. Again, this is also just going to be, again, shining a light on a very overlooked part of history that we don't normally talk about in school or in politics, or this is just something, again, we just never really talk about. In regular history. Being a Pullman porter, regardless of how badly they were treated, and yeah, they were very poorly treated, and we'll get into the exact dirty details in a moment, it was one of the best jobs that a black man could get prior to the civil rights era. Compared to manual labor or working as a maid, being a Pullman porter offered black men and their families the best vehicle to economic advancement prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Before we can get into that, though, we need to go into more of the context of what the Pullman Porters were, what the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was, and what they did, and talk about the Pullman Palace Car Company. So the Pullman Palace Car Company was the manufacturer and operator of sleeping cars in the United States from 1867 until 1969. Although in 1944, Pullman was ordered by a court to divest itself from either the manufacturing side of the business or the sleeping car operation side of the business, and Pullman decided to keep the manufacturing side of the business, and Pullman Standard, which is what the sleeping car manufacturer became known as after that point, or it might have been before. Again, not really relevant to the name of the story, or this current story. And the sleeping car operations were sold off to a consortium of the various railroads that Pullman cars operated on. The order also allowed the railroads to buy the Pullman cars instead of having the cars owned and operated by Pullman, and then basically only collecting enough ticket revenue to justify hauling the cars, because that was a thing that we talked about in the sleeping car type video, which was the first video I ever made, was that the Pullman accommodation fare was a separate charge from your rail ticket, and that charge was basically the hotel charge for the car, and you had to pay a separate ticket to the railroad because that's how it worked back then. The order also made it so that Pullman couldn't put clauses into their operational contracts that would force railways to only work with Pullman when it came to the operations, maintenance, and furnishing of sleeping cars on their system or on through trains to other railways. From 1947 to 1969, sleeping cars made by any manufacturer would be operated by Pullman, and Pullman-made cars could be operated directly by the railroads themselves if they so chose. In its highest year, 34 million people rode in Pullman-operated sleeping cars. Just as a comparison, I think Amtrak's latest numbers before the current pandemic, I think their ridership was at 31 million, and that's all people, including everybody in coach, everyone riding on business class, everyone riding in a sleeping car. That's everybody was 31 million. And Pullman at its peak, which I think was in the 1920s, carried 34 million people a night, or in a year, rather. Not in a night. That'd be like almost a third of the U.S. population, and people did not travel that much. Sorry about that. So the first Pullman-operated car was built in 1859, and at this time, the first Pullman Porters were hired in 1867. At this time, conductors were only white, and were white because this is just a whites-only job. And generally a job, if you were in a passenger train, it was a job you got at the end of your career, not at the beginning, unlike today. So basically, a little bit about how train crews work. You have your engineer, and your conductor is the captain of the train. And freight trains still do have conductors on them. It's just that they're not a part of the what we think about when it comes to running a train. And they're there basically to deal with like paperwork and other stuff. And in a sense, just to keep the engineer company and keep them awake if they're on a freight train. Passenger trains, they do a lot of other stuff like ticket collection, fare enforcement, just dealing with stuff as it comes up on the train. But anyways, as I said, this was still like a very much a whites-only job, no matter at least prior to 1964. God, I can English. Anyways, conductor, the passengers wanted, at least Pullman wanted to keep the passengers happy. So Pullman only hired newly freed slaves from the South to be porters. And being porter was a very menial job compared to a conductor, but they did sometimes do conductor jobs, which we'll get into the union struggle because that was a big highlight of it. Porters had to lug bags for usually upper middle class white passengers and later middle class passengers. They had to shine shoes at night. They had to make the beds when the passengers wanted to go to bed. And George Pullman hired the freed slaves because he figured they would make perfect servants due to their time as slaves, which gave them experiencing catering to someone's every whim. He also figured that the white clientele would be able to ignore the porters as they were on board. Just as I guess that was as a courtesy, I guess. I mean, we're talking like a social situation that is just so alien to me and probably to anybody listening to this that I just don't understand this. Like another thing off topic was that when I went and saw one of these old Pullman cars in the Sacramento Railroad Museum, the bedding that Pullman porters had, and this was probably later in their career because at first they only got like maybe a couple hours of sleep at night. They actually had to dye the old bedding blue because especially in the South, the passengers, the white passengers, because they're usually upper middle class and eventually middle class, would be so offended if their bedding was ever used by a black person that the real ones used by the passengers were pink and the ones used by the crew were blue, because that's just how people were back then. The porters also had to work long hours for very low pay. Their monthly working hours before the recognition and the contract with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was 400 hours a month. For comparison, there are 720 hours in a 30-day month, just for comparison. So porters worked about 20 hours a day and were only allowed to sleep in between assignments, and this treatment was purely down to racism and classism because they basically figured, yeah, these people just aren't worth anything because they're poor and they're black. That literally was the reason. Now the question you may be asking is why being a Pullman porter was such a good thing. I thought you said that this was, all bad and racism and a hard history and, monopolies, classism, racism, so on, yada, yada, yada. Well, the good thing about being a Pullman porter was that it was a window into upper middle class white lifestyles and later the middle class, which, again, was just a big cultural exposure to the people at the time, or at least people who were black at the time. Being a Pullman porter gave a mistreated underclass a look into how people in the upper class levels of society lived, how they ate, how they communicated, and eventually gave them connections as time would go on. Because this is a thing that I think even Amtrak does today, is that a person who's assigned in a sleeping car is assigned to the sleeping car, not necessarily to the routes or to the however else you would do that. You're assigned to the car, so you're always on that car unless you're on vacation. If you travel on the same train frequently enough, you might actually be talking to the same porter and same sleeping car attendant today on Amtrak. So these people, not these people, but the people riding the train and the people working on the trains would get to know each other to some extent, even in a time where that was very much frowned upon and was kind of not the point of hiring a black person that you would hope your white clientele would just ignore. They did get to know each other over time. That actually did help, especially when like movie stars would be taking trains around the country. This also, again, gave them something to aspire towards for them and their families. Other things that further helped this was that the passengers would leave things like newspapers and magazines behind on the trains as they left. As time went on and literacy rates improved, this inadvertently gave them access to media, ideas, culture that would otherwise not have been not have been given to them or ever been exposed to because they would have stayed working on it as a sharecropper in the South. Another thing that came with being close to members of the upper class was the prospect of career advancement. It wasn't uncommon for a Pullman porter to go from working from Pullman to working in some of the finest restaurants and hotels in the country at the time. One porter, J.W. Mays, once served President McKinley, or William McKinley, on a train, and he was hired to work at the White House where he worked for 40 years. So despite being forced to respond to George, the first name of the Pullman Company's founder, being a porter did lead to social advancement in a way frankly not seen on any level until the Civil Rights Movement and frankly the Second World War, where a lot of these stereotypes had to get challenged for the sake of surviving as a country. So in some small ways, having black men serve the upper class of the United States helped change the perception of black people as a whole, instead of solidifying society's preconceived notions about black people as a race, quote unquote. Not the channel for that discussion. This was totally historical, so let's just move on from that. So another benefit to being a Pullman porter was that you got to travel around the country, which put these men in contact with people that they otherwise wouldn't. Porters would have to work the whole train from end to end, as I mentioned, that you were assigned to the car, not to the train, or to a certain set number of hours. So this meant Pullman porters could be assigned to trains that ran all the way across the country, but be from Tennessee, Georgia, wherever in the South. And traveling around the country was not something that people who were working class were really able to do that easily back then. Trains were the only way to travel for a very long time, and they were generally priced so that only people who were middle class could ride them by and large. And if you're working on a farm or you're an average factory worker, basically you didn't ride the train. Or if you did, you rode a very slow second-class train that may not have gone very far because you and your family just didn't really move very much. Or if you were lucky enough to have a car, you took a car. Once Greyhound started getting going and the Continental Trailways, you could take buses. But again, we're talking like 1800s, early 1900s, before there was really good highways. So not only did they get their hands on newspapers and get to talk to the people that would be reading them, and just at people in general that they otherwise wouldn't be able to meet and speak with, they were able to get all this from the opposite side of the country. It was a common practice for porters to pick up newspapers and magazines from all across the country and bring them home. This gave their oftentimes isolated and segregated southern communities a glimpse into life outside the South. These views actually did encourage people to move outside of the South and was one of the catalysts for the Great Migration that would see about 6 million people leave the South by any means for cities in the North and the West to fill labor shortages during the World Wars and well into the 1960s. Pullman Porters also helped their families and their communities with more than just knowledge and connections gained by traveling the country, but by using their tips to save for their family's future. This included sending their kids to college, helping them find decent jobs, and even getting some of their sons into the career of being Pullman Porter themselves. Notable children of Pullman Porters, just for reference, include Oakland Mayor Willie Brown, former Oakland Mayor Willie Brown, former LA Mayor Tom Bradley, a pianist named Oscar Peterson, and a person who was on the Olympics, I believe, Wilma Rudolph, and hundreds, if not thousands, of others. It was noted by historians both then and now that the Pullman Porter was seen in more movies than any actor of the day, that they would inspire other civil rights legends like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and the organizing efforts that helped lay the foundations of the civil rights movement that we laud in schools to this day. So again, if there's one thing I want to get out of this, is that organization and advancement in the modern world does not just come out of a vacuum. The Pullman Porters as an institution, as a group, as individual workers, so much laid the foundation for what would come a century after the first one was hired, and we just completely ignore this history. Just completely ignore it. Like, it almost seems like, oh yeah, the birth of the civil rights movement in the 50s was just something that just happened, and that it was just a self-evident truth that this would happen and that students would organize, not knowing that for nearly 80 years there were people struggling to have their rights recognized, struggling to have a fair labor contract, and just struggling to just be a part of the American mainstream. People struggled for 80 years, and the burst of activity that we got was, again, a good thing, but that there was a foundation, there was a struggle before that struggle could start. And again, we just ignore that in history class. So anyways, this leads us into the actual Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the activities that they engaged in to receive recognition and improve the lives of their members. I'm just going to call them the Brotherhood at this point. Little reference to the Fallout series, which I love, but again, something I just to keep my life from having to say Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters a billion times. Anyways, they started organizing in 1925. This is a few years after the Pullman Company had established the Pullman Porters Benefit Association, which was effectively an in-company union, which provided pensions, disability benefits, a stock buying program, and other benefits to porters. The porters realized that the only way that they were truly going to improve their lives was to organize a truly independent union to represent their own interests. In August of 1925, they did just that. The original leaders were all porters except for one person, Philip Randolph. Randolph was a publicist and organizer and leader among the African American community. The original leaders of the union had to eke out odd jobs and small business ventures while they worked to build the Brotherhood, because again, if you were caught union organizing at this point, and even to this day, you're usually fired. It's just a, God, what was I going to say, hazard of your profession. And Pullman, again, pulled out all the stops to try to prevent the Brotherhood from forming and gaining recognition. This included, as I said, firing anyone who showed sympathies to an independent union, and having spies go into the company to root out anyone that was sympathetic to trying to organize people into the Porters Union, or the Brotherhood rather. Despite this, many porters and maids paid dues into the union, and the Brotherhood continued to organize. The road to recognition was a very hard one. Again, this was a time when being racist and openly racist was a normal thing for people and institutions within our society. Let's make no bones about that. Let's not sugarcoat it. We're talking the 1920s, not 2020s. Again, there's still problems, But again, things back then were so much more worse. Anyways, the road to recognition, again, a hard one, but it came with many small victories before they were fully recognized and secured a contract. In 1926, the Brotherhood tried to get the ICC, which is the Interstate Commerce Commission who regulated the railways at the time, to review the wages of the Pullman Company. Starting in 1930, they tried to gain some sort of injunction based on the Railways Act in 1926. In 1933, the Railway Emergency Act was passed, which outlawed company unions in the railway industry, but not for Pullman or the express agencies, which, by the way, the express agencies like American Express were the people who did. They were basically like the UPS of the day, and they used the railways to ship stuff. Through public pressure, the Brotherhood managed to get the law amended, and these amendments were passed through Congress in 1934. The amended piece of legislation gave the Brotherhood the ability to appeal to the National Mediation Board for recognition as a union. One quick note on this is that the National Mediation Board is basically the railroad and aviation version of the National Labor's Relation Board, or NLRB. Since railways and aviation were regulated before most of the New Deal reforms went through, railroads to this day maintain different federal regulatory boards and programs that other private sector workers don't have, even if they have a parallel institution. And this is just one of those, historical things that we just have in America. For whatever reason, we've just never consolidated them. Another example of this is that railroad employees have their unemployment insurance, their disability, and their retirement managed by the Railroad Retirement Board, which is like Social Security, unemployment, and pensions all in one. But it's semi-separate from Social Security, and it's gone back and forth as to whether or not railroad employees get Social Security. It's like my grandfather was a railroad worker. He paid into it for a while, then paid into Social Security as well as the pension. It's weird, and that could be a video on its own. But anyways. In 1934, the Brotherhood won the recognition, or at least the first path to actually getting officially recognized to represent the porters and the maids. In October 1934, Pullman reorganized the company union to make it look independent, at least on paper. This even made the company union be employee managed and funded, but from the sources I found, employee, quote unquote, was used very loosely when it came to employee managed, and seemed to be anyone from within the Pullman company could manage the company porter union. So yeah, very, very underhanded and dirty, and still basically controlled by the company. This was the beginning of the fight between the Brotherhood and the Pullman Company. Pullman also got African American ministers and black newspaper to denounce the union. Like, they went full holds bar on this. They did the red baiting, which is like saying it was a foreign plot to ruin America. Other Red Scare tactics, like they're communists, they're going to destroy you, they're going to probably eat your babies or whatever. Because basically think the stuff going on in modern politics between the Democrats and Republicans, but like turned up to 10. The union also fought back by using churches and as pulpits, that those not in the Brotherhood were race traders, Uncle Tom, so on. So basically think everything that we're doing today, but still turned way up. Because again, this was also a very big issue. This was also going to be a first. So the union's election was set for between May 27th and June 27th, 1935. The long story short was that there were over 8,300 eligible voters in this election, and the Brotherhood got votes from over 5,000 workers, and the company union only won a majority in Atlanta, Memphis, and Louisville, whereas the Brotherhood won the majority in the other 25 cities that Pullman operated in. So again, pretty much landslide victory for them. So despite being held in high regard by African Americans, the work that was required for the porters was far more than most people saw, and the porters made less than even the most low-skilled industrial worker. So for example, the average porter made $16 a week, or $880 per year, whereas people working in factories made $19 per week. This was based on 1934 income levels that the Brotherhood was using when it was pushing for its contract with Pullman. This was on top of Pullman porters being forced to buy their own uniform. They had to provide their own shoe shining supplies. They had to pay for their own food at half of Pullman prices. They had to sleep in the smoking lounge on cars after the passengers went to sleep, and they literally would still be at the beck and call even while asleep. And I've also have to note that Pullman food prices were also really expensive, even for middle-class passengers riding in the trains. For example, a dinner plate in a first-class train could cost the equivalent of $22 in $20, and the average wage of a Pullman porter was $3.14 an hour. So you're paying $11 for your food, which is like 4 hours worth of work. Mind you worked 100 hours a week, but again, it was ridiculous. It also must be remembered that the porters, as I said, they worked an average of 73 hours a week. Sorry, I just read further down my notes. I'm not blind and don't speak English, I swear. And also that made their average hourly wage in unadjusted dollars 16 cents. But Pullman porters were paid by miles traveled and not necessarily by hours worked, and they were expected to travel 11,000 miles a month. So yeah, wages were different. So the time the time that Pullman Porters spent getting their cars ready was unpaid time, effectively, because they weren't traveling anywhere. At this time, it was estimated that the minimum annual income for a family of 4 would be between $1,200 and $1,500 per year. The $1,500 figure was for people living in large cities, which is where most Pullman Porters tend to live, since they tended to be stationed around cities, because that's where all the terminals were. Also, for reference, most of the people working at this time who were making the $7 or $19 a week were only working around 35 hours a week on average and made 56 cents an hour. Pullman Porters worked nearly twice, they worked more than twice that many hours and made 27 cents an hour after tips were included. So anyways, as time went on, the demands in 1925 by the union were a $150 monthly salary and the end of tipping as a practice, a maximum of 240 working hours per month, including the terminal time, which is the time they would spend getting ready, pay for deadheading, which is basically if you had to work from a different terminal. So like if you were train had stopped in Oakland, but your next assignment was in LA, you had to get paid for the time in between the going from Oakland to Los Angeles. Be guaranteed 4 hours of sleep on the first night of a train's trip and 6 on any subsequent night. Be paid a conductor's wage when they had to do a conductor's job instead of a $12 stipend. As I said, being a conductor at this time was only a white-only job because segregation. Increase the pension to more than $16 per month after 40 years of service. Post name tags in cars to end the practice of calling the porters George. And then 10 years later, when they actually did get a contract, these were the, 4 main things that they won. They won a $175 monthly salary, $240 monthly work time cap, sick time, and a grievance process. And yes, it did take them like nearly 12 years to go from like we're fighting, technically like 11, almost 12 years from the time they started organizing to the time they actually got a contract, because that's just how much of a roadblock they faced. But this achievement was a milestone for African Americans, the labor movement, the budding civil rights movement. This was the first time a majority black union not only won recognition as a union from the federal government, but was actually able to strike a contract with a major American company. This was the first time that black workers could claim to be on an even footing with white workers in any way in the labor movement. Prior to this, most unions were segregated, which meant black workers were not allowed, and they would just be exploited by their employers and just otherwise, just in general, treated like crap. And having an exploitable group of workers is always the best thing for unions, since they totally won't be scabs. That's a joke if you weren't able to tell. On that note, Pullman actually hired black people to break up striking white workers when their factory workers would go on strike. So again, having an exploitable working class is a very good thing for unions. So the formation and recognition of a majority black union also was a big boon for the civil rights movement, because the organization of the workers and their families spread beyond just the union. The main spillover was the creation of the Ladies Auxiliary, which was the organization for the wives of the porters and helped organize the maids into the union, which were, again, generally black and some Chinese women, oddly enough, at least on the West Coast. The auxiliary helped spread pro-union media amongst various communities across the country. They helped fundraise for the union, and they would help with union organizing efforts. They helped connect communities across the country with each other. They also helped organize other efforts that would push for equal protections and recognitions for the rights of African Americans, which would, again, help just developed the civil rights movement in general. This included E.D. Nixon, who was a union organizer for the Brotherhood, who bailed out Rosa Parks and organized the Montgomery bus boycott, and even tapped Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the effort while he was working. So there is a direct and forgotten line in this country that runs from the newly freed slaves directly to the civil rights movement that passes through the labor movement in this country. If it weren't for the Pullman Porters, the civil rights movement may not have gotten off the ground when it did, and it may not have had the power that it did. Leaders and organizers from the Brotherhood also went on to shape the Civil Rights Act and other subsequent legislation that came after the Second World War, political activity within the Democratic Party, they even helped organize the March on Washington. So again, this forgotten group that were people like literally were just freed, they left the South, they started these jobs. 2 or 3 generations later, the union that they struggled so hard to get, to give them just recognition of being human, and that they deserve time off, that they deserve not to be exploited, that they deserve to make a living wage, gave us the civil rights movement, and we've completely ignored that history. in this country because reasons. This brings us where this also brings us to where this channel always ends up, the era where passenger trains started to decline and the early days of Amtrak. For those of you that don't know much about railroad history, passenger trains used to be run by privately owned freight railways until 1971. By the 1960s, trains were in massive decline. The railways had stopped properly maintaining their trains and facilities. Train routes were getting cut continuously, and service were becoming less and less luxurious over time, just in an attempt to save money. Some of this was also just neglect, and some of this was an intentional ploy to drive passengers off of trains. Cough, cough, the formerly friendly Southern Pacific Railroad. Anyways, they did this so they could just petition the ICC to discontinue the train entirely. This meant that the Brotherhood was in decline because its membership was retiring and the positions that were being eliminated as routes were being eliminated just weren't being replaced because the services were usually being cut. Basically, trains were being used to shuttle around people and coach and carry mail service, since first-class passengers were abandoning trains for generally planes since the Boeing 707 brought airfares down enough to be competitive with a multi-day train ride and would turn a cross-country trip from like a 3-day voyage on train to a 6 to 8 hour flight. And again, before the jet age, I talked about this in a different video, was that taking a cross-country flight would cost the equivalent of $4,000 a person, whereas a train was $1,200. Just cost comparison. And that's $4,000 in modern money, not $4,000 in like 1940s money. That's like just so we're clear in my ramblings. Anyways, in 1970, Congress passed the National Railroad Passenger Act, which allowed the freight railways to outsource the requirement to run passenger trains to the quasi-public entity for the low price of donating their passenger equipment and giving some cash over to the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which is Amtrak. But the Brotherhood did continue to exist until 1978. In 1978, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters merged with the Brotherhood of Railroad and Airline Clerks, or BRAC, which I'm just kind of going with. At the time, they only had 1,000 members left, which I think at their height, they had like almost 10,000, or was it 5,000? I don't remember. There had also been a large amount of change since the time the union was formed. For one, the Pullman Company, at least the rail car operating portion, had ceased to exist in 1969, and the title and job had also changed with the formation of Amtrak. When Amtrak took over train service, employee non-discrimination laws were enforced far more stringently and thoroughly. This meant that formerly segregated careers were being desegregated for real this time, they were desegregating things, which meant that Amtrak started hiring African-American onboard service staff and non-white conductors and engineers. This integration brought along a new social attitude, not only amongst the employees, but also amongst the public in general. So the non-black employees didn't want to be called porters when they were working in sleeping cars, so the title was changed to sleeping car attendant, or SCA. The former porters still left their mark, though. The ones that weren't old enough to retire did continue to work for Amtrak in its first 20 years of existence. The old heads, quote-unquote, as they were referred to, initiated the new employees in the ways of the Pullman Porter and the high standards that was required for the job. By the early 90s, though, the last echoes of this proud tradition had started in 1867, just dying out as porters got old. The former porters at this point, because at this point they were technically sleeping car attendants, they were retiring from Amtrak. But they didn't just leave behind a legacy of service at Amtrak, which we'll get into people's issues with Amtrak in a future video. But what they left behind, a legacy that embodies the U.S. at its best. The yearning to be seen and treated as equal in the face of a society that is saying no, to have a better today, a better tomorrow for themselves and their community, the lowering of arbitrary barriers and the recognition of the right to live freely and in dignity is also their legacy. Their historic victory in securing a labor contract in 1935 and 20 years of labor activism that led to the period that most Americans would regard as probably our finest hour that wasn't a war is their legacy. Their legacy is embodied by Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., even if they're not mentioned there, if they're not put there. Their legacy is the ability of a non-white person to be a train engineer or conductor in America's railroads. They set that precedent. They're very much the forgotten heroes of America in a way, and definitely. So to bring this back to the impact of the West Coast, before we fully conclude, specifically to California, since this channel is probably going to mostly revolve around the West Coast of the United States. The Pullman Porters' impact in Oakland and Los Angeles, which were the two Pullman terminals in California. Pullman Porters were based out of Oakland, were required to live in West Oakland, west of Adeline Street, which I'm not really sure where it is in Oakland because I don't know West Oakland that well. This was to make sure that they could work and be, called in at short notice. The wages and concentration of porters in West Oakland led to it becoming the hub of the black community in this part of California. The wages they earned allowed them to buy homes in West Oakland, allowed the rise of black-owned businesses, the rise of churches and benevolent societies, which are basically charities, but they were a little bit more regulated than just we're giving you money and then, like a food bank or what we think of as charity today. They're also like civic organizations. But anyways, this helped create a strong and vibrant community in West Oakland, which in some ways is still there to this day. And the same was true in Los Angeles. People from all stripes had come from across the country to LA searching for a better life, and the first black neighborhoods were built by the Pullman Porters and other African Americans that worked for the railroads that terminated in Los Angeles. The oldest remaining former Pullman Porter as of 2010 at least, because again, the last generation of Pullman Porters that were hired, I think were hired like in the 50s. So I think they're all basically retired by now. He just talked about how the Porters and other African American railroad employees left a mark on American society, like that they were the community in a way, that they built up the community. And hopefully I will throw the links to the sources of this one, because this is a very rich history that we sadly overlook in America, and it's literally the history that gave us the civil rights movement, and frankly it did a lot to make America live up to its promises, as much as we don't to this day. The fact that they basically came from being seen as little more than I guess just basically one step above a servant, to basically breaking down barriers and changing the way we think of society and the way we think of certain lines of work is just something that's so powerful. It's sad that we ignore it.